He did not ask for money and left no notes. He took lives because he believed they were stolen. In the mid-1990s, while some were building business empires, he was creating his own bloody utopia where there was no place for the rich and successful. He was nicknamed the Brick, and this nickname struck terror throughout the Moscow region. The summer of 1994 was hot in the Moscow region. The country, not yet recovered from one shock, was already standing on the brink of another. The air was saturated with the smell of big money and cheap vodka, scarlet jackets, and expired canned goods. New Russians were building 3-story fortresses of red brick, fencing themselves off from the old world, which was living out its final days in grey panel houses and dilapidated factory towns. These two worlds existed side by side, separated by an invisible wall of hatred and envy. It was in the cracks of this wall that a monster was born, who would soon become known to the whole country. In the settlement of Malakovka, Lyubertsy district. Here, amidst pines and Dhaka fences, the new Russian bourgeoisie was emerging. Some opened hairdressing salons, others the first commercial stalls selling imported beer and Snickers bars. 42-year-old Antonina Velichko was one of them. She was called the Queen of Retail in Malakovka. 2 grocery stores near the station and a small pharmacy brought in an income that seemed astronomical to the locals. Antonina was a bright, authoritative woman, accustomed to making all decisions herself. She had been widowed in the late 1980s when her engineer husband died of heart failure, and since then, she had supported her student son and her entire business. Her cherry red 9, bought just 1 year ago, was a symbol of success, a challenge to the grey, impoverished reality. She loved speed, loud music, and expensive cigarettes. Neighbors looked at her with a mixture of admiration and poorly concealed malice. "She stole it!" hissed an old woman on a bench. "What a woman!" clucked the men at the stall she owned. On July the 12th, Antonina was making her usual rounds. In those times, money was carried in cash. In sports bags, bandits, racketeers, and roofs, protection rackets existed, but Velichko knew how to negotiate. She paid those she needed to, and they left her alone. That evening, she was supposed to be home by 8 o'clock. Her son was waiting for her with dinner, but at 9 o'clock, her phone was still silent. At 10, her son began calling her friends and partners. No one had seen her after 6 in the evening. The last time she was seen was at the pharmacy, where she was talking to a tall man. He was sturdy, with short hair and a square face, like a brick, an elderly pharmacist later told the investigator. The man was helping her load boxes into the trunk. Antonina laughed and thanked him. The pharmacist thought it was a new guard or driver. At 11 o'clock at night, Antonina's son filed a police report. The duty officer accepted the statement without much enthusiasm. "Wait, maybe she is out having fun somewhere. It happens to everyone. She will return," he said tiredly. In the 90s, the disappearance of a person, especially a business person, was not something unusual. Payback for debts, kidnappings for ransom. There were many scenarios. But Antonina owed nothing to anyone and seemed to have no enemies capable of such a thing. Her car was found only 2 days later. The cherry-red Lada 9 was parked on the side of the Yegorievsk highway, tens of kilometers from Malakovka. The doors were locked, and the interior was in perfect order. On the passenger seat lay her handbag, documents, apartment keys, and an expensive lighter. There was no money, but no signs of a struggle either. Experts carefully examined every centimeter of the interior and trunk. No fingerprints, except those of the owner. No bloodstains, no foreign hair, nothing. As if the woman had stopped, got out of the car, and dissolved into thin air. Investigators worked through standard theories. Robbery, but then why abandon an almost new car? Kidnapping. But no ransom demands were received. Murder due to business. But her business was too small for serious criminal wars. The case began to bog down in routine, turning into another unsolved case. But it was then that the nickname The Brick was first whispered in kitchens and smoking rooms. The same pharmacist, describing Antonina's helper, let it slip. "Face like a brick." The nickname stuck. Someone remembered seeing a similar man a couple of weeks ago at the stall of another businesswoman from the neighboring Ramensky district. She had also disappeared. Her white Moskvich was later found on the side of the road. Who was this ghost with the square face? Investigators began digging through archives and questioning tens of people. But the man, known only by his terrifying nickname, seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. His portrait was compiled from scraps of phrases, frightened glances, and guesses. Tall, almost 2 meters, short haircut, broad shoulders that seemed too wide to fit through a doorway, and eyes, cold, empty, expressionless. He didn't speak, he just looked. And that gaze made people feel uncomfortable. In reality, he had a name, Andrei Kravtsov, 29 years old. His entire life was one continuous wound that never healed. He was born into a world that did not need him. His mother was a drug addict and died of an overdose when he was less than 5 years old. He never knew his father. Orphanage number 7 in Lyubertsy became his family, school, and prison all at once. There, he learned the main law of his life. Strike first, or you will be struck. There he got his nickname, not only for his square, heavy jaw, but also for his ability to resolve any conflict with one blow. He didn't fight. He broke things. At 14, this ended in tragedy. A quarrel with other students, someone's stupid joke. And Kravtsov lunged at a boy from the younger group. He didn't just beat him. In a rage that even he himself could not explain, he sank his teeth into the victim's neck. He bit through the carotid artery. Doctors miraculously saved the boy. But he remained disabled for life. Andrei Kravtsov was sent to a correctional facility for minors. This was his university. There he finally understood. The world is divided into predators and victims, and he would never be a victim again. After his release, he wandered, earning a living with odd jobs, as a loader at the market, a bouncer in a cheap cafe, a bodyguard for petty gangsters who feared him. Even experienced criminals respected him. Not for his strength, there were many strong men, but for his animal fearlessness and silence. He never threatened anyone, and never raised his voice. He simply did what needed to be done. Psychiatrists who later studied his case would say that inside this man lived an explosive mixture of complexes, rage, and deep contempt for those he considered the masters of life. Those who, in his words, live for their own pleasure while we rot. He hated their cars, their women, their laughter, their confidence in tomorrow. He believed they had stolen his own life from him. And he decided the time for reckoning had come. The investigators didn't know this. For them, the brick was a ghost, a vague image from the testimonies of frightened witnesses. But the ghost had gained flesh and blood, and had already acquired a taste for it. Later, during interrogation, Kravtsov would say that the first episode was not planned. It was a flash, an animal reaction to humiliation that had been accumulating in him for years. 3 months before the disappearance of Antonina Velichko in the late spring, he was working as a loader at a small wholesale market near Zhukovsky. He was unloading trucks with Turkish jeans and Polish furniture. The work was exhausting, and the pay was meager. That day it was raining, and his old jacket was soaked through. He was finishing his shift when a shiny Mercedes pulled up to the market gates. In those days, such a car was like a spaceship. Behind the wheel sat a woman of about 50, in an expensive cashmere coat and bright makeup. It was Marina Skuratova, the owner of several trading pavilions. She was in a hurry. She needed to pick up boxes of goods, but her driver had fallen ill. Seeing Kravtsov, she grimaced with disgust and shouted from the car window, "Hey you, come here, help me load this, I'll pay you." He approached silently. He smelled of sweat and cheap tobacco. She handed him a crumpled bill. "Don't stain the seats with your overalls, you know they cost me money." This phrase became her death sentence. He didn't answer, just nodded. While he hauled heavy boxes, she talked on her mobile phone, laughing loudly and complaining to a friend about the stinking bumpkins she had to deal with. Kravtsov heard every word. Something inside him snapped. A rage awoke that had been dormant since his time in prison. He finished the work, took the money and left. But he remembered her face, her car, her voice. He watched her for 1 week. He found out where she lived and what route she took. He didn't think of a plan, he just waited. The moment came when she was returning home late at night. He waited for her on a dark stretch of road, rolling an old tire onto the roadway. She stopped, got out of the car, cursing. He approached from behind. She didn't even have time to scream. In the trunk of her Mercedes, he drove her to an abandoned pioneer camp, where, as an orphan, he had once spent summer vacations. There, in the damp basement of the old canteen, he killed for the first time. And then, to get rid of the body, he did what became his signature move. From the same market where he worked, he stole a heavy butcher's cleaver. With this cleaver, he dismembered Marina Skuratova's body. The remains, packed in sugar sacks, he threw into the Moscow River. He drove the Mercedes to another district and abandoned it in a courtyard. He acted instinctively but with amazing cold-bloodedness, as if he had been doing this all his life. Skuratova's disappearance was attributed to bandit reprisals. Her business was much larger than Velichko's. No one even thought to link it to a silent loader. This first experience showed Kravtsov what he was capable of. He could take everything from the masters of life, including life itself, and remain unpunished. He felt no fear, only a dull, gloomy satisfaction. He quit his job at the market and began his hunt. Now he acted more intelligently. He no longer waited for a chance. He sought it out. He visited expensive markets and new shopping centers, watching. He was interested in women, single, self-confident, who controlled the situation and made their own decisions. In his twisted mind, they were the embodiment of the injustice of this world. He would approach them and offer his help. His imposing appearance worked in his favor. Women saw him as a potential guard, a reliable helper. He spoke little, looked at the floor, which created an image of a humble, hard-working man. He won their trust, learned their schedules and routes. So it was with Antonina Velichko and another victim, about whom no one knew at that time, Irina Samoylova, the owner of a chain of hairdressing salons in Voskresensk. She was found 1 month after Velichko's murder. Or rather, not her, but what was left of her. On an early August morning, 2 fishermen in the Brunitsy area caught a heavy canvas bag in their net. When they dragged it ashore and opened it, they nearly vomited from horror and the stench. Inside was a human torso, without a head, without limbs. The operative group, arriving at the scene, combed the river bottom. During the day, divers raised 2 more bags. One contained legs, the other arms. The head was never found. The remains were identified only by a miraculously preserved appendectomy scar and the missing persons database. It was 38-year-old Irina Samoylova. She had disappeared 3 weeks ago. As in the other cases, her Volvo automobile was found abandoned in Lyubertsy, and again, there were no clues in the car. The examination showed that the body had been dismembered professionally with one precise and decisive blow. The criminal was likely familiar with anatomy or had experience butchering carcasses. Major Savaliev, a stern 50-year-old man of the old school, an investigator for important cases of the main Directorate of Internal Affairs of the Moscow region, put 3 folders on the table. Skuratova, Velichko, and Samoylova. 3 different districts, 3 cases that at first glance were not connected. But the old detective's intuition told him that this was the handiwork of the same person. Successful female entrepreneurs, all of them disappeared along with their cars, which were later found empty and clean, and now this gruesome signature with dismemberment. Savaliev realized they were dealing not with a gangster or a robber. They were dealing with a serial killer, a monster who methodically and coldly destroyed a certain type of women. He wrote the name, The Brick, which he had heard in rumors, on the cover of a new general folder. Now, at least, the Ghost had a nickname. But while the police were just beginning to realize the scale of the tragedy, Kravtsov had already chosen his next victim. He was sitting in a summer cafe near the market in Podolsk, drinking cheap coffee and watching the owner of a flower pavilion. She was loudly scolding a saleswoman. Her voice rang with power and steel. The very voice he hated so much. Her name was Svetlana Orlova, 46 years old. Tough, energetic, one of those called successful women. In Soviet times, she worked as an agronomist at a collective farm. And with the beginning of perestroika, she was one of the first to realize that money could be made on flowers. She started with bouquets of asters from her garden, and by 1995, she had expanded her business to 2 pavilions and signed an exclusive contract for the supply of Dutch roses. Her silver Audi 80 was her pride and joy. 10 years ago, she kicked her husband out due to drunkenness, and her daughter was studying in Moscow on a paid basis. Svetlana was used to commanding and tolerated no objections. The saleswomen feared her. Suppliers respected her. For Kravtsov, she was the perfect specimen in his collection. He watched her for 1 week. He noticed that every few days she drove herself to the wholesale base to buy soil and fertilizers. The bags were heavy, and there were never enough loaders at the base. This was his chance. He waited for her at the warehouse. Crumpled clothes, hunched shoulders, a guilty look, he had mastered this mask to perfection. "Madam, can I help you? A woman shouldn't carry such heavy things." Svetlana looked him over appraisingly. 2 meters tall, a mountain of muscle. Exactly what she needed. "How much will you charge?" she asked quickly. "Whatever you give for bread," he mumbled. In 15 minutes, he carried 2 tens of bags of peat to her car. He worked silently and quickly, without breaks. Svetlana was pleased. She was looking for a handyman who would help with repairs in the pavilion, as well as deliver and pick up things. She gave him more money than he asked for, and her phone number. "Call me tomorrow. There will be work for you." Kravtsov nodded and disappeared. He called, and over the next 2 weeks he became her shadow. He repaired shelves, unloaded goods, swept the premises. He was the ideal worker. He didn't drink, was silent and efficient. Svetlana even began to trust him, sometimes leaving him alone in the pavilion. She didn't see the cold, appraising emptiness in his eyes when he looked at her back. She only saw cheap labor. Meanwhile, gloom reigned in Major Savalayev's office. 3 murders, 0 leads, not a single fingerprint. No reliable witness, except for general descriptions of a large man. The only pattern was the modus operandi. Victim, car, method of body disposal. Savalayev understood that the killer was a thoughtful, cautious man, and would continue. He insisted on bringing in a consulting psychologist from Moscow, Professor Viktor Nefedov, one of the first Russian specialists in compiling psychological profiles of criminals. Nefedov, a grey-haired intellectual in glasses, studied the case materials for several days. His conclusions made the investigators shudder. "Your suspect," said Nefedov, pacing slowly around the office, "is not just a robber. Money for him is merely a symbol. He kills not for profit but for an idea. He belongs to the type of so-called aggrieved. Most likely he is from a dysfunctional family, possibly an orphan. In childhood, he suffered severe psychological trauma associated with humiliation, possibly from a woman in a position of power. His victims are not random people. He chooses those who, in his opinion, symbolize success, power, and that very female dominance that once traumatized him. He seeks revenge. For him, every murder is an act of restoring justice, as he understands it. He will not stop on his own. He will kill until he is caught. Look for him in places where social contrasts are visible to the naked eye, at markets, construction sites, train stations. He wants to be closer to his victims, but at the same time remain invisible to them, part of the grey mass. He is a shadow man. The portrait was frighteningly accurate. Savalayev ordered a check of all former orphanage wards and colony graduates fitting this description. It was a titanic task, hundreds, if not thousands, of names. The list was so huge that it seemed it would take years to process. Kravtsov didn't know he was already being hunted. He was preparing the final chord in the story with Svetlana Orlova. One evening, when she was closing the pavilion, he was helping her as usual. "Andrei," she said, locking the door, "drive me home. I'm tired today and the car is acting up." This was exactly what he had been waiting for. He sat behind the wheel of her Audi. She sat next to him in the passenger seat and gave instructions to her daughter on the phone. Her voice was authoritative and sharp. He turned off the lit highway onto a dark country road. "Where are you going?" Svetlana asked in surprise. "This is the shortest way to my house." "I know the road, madam." "It will be faster this way," he replied quietly. She didn't have time to understand anything. The blow of his fist was terrible. He knocked her out instantly. Then everything went according to plan. The abandoned pioneer camp, the damp basement, his faithful instrument, the heavy butcher's cleaver he always carried in his bag. But this time, something went wrong. He was in a hurry to get rid of the bags with the remains. Dawn was breaking. One of the bags, which he threw from a bridge into the Pakra River, was improperly weighted. Instead of sinking, it caught on a snag near the bank, hidden under the water but not carried away by the current. Kravtsov didn't notice this. He drove the Audi to a residential area of Klimovsk, thoroughly wiped the steering wheel and door handles, and left, disappearing into the morning fog. He was confident in his impunity. 2 days later, the Podolsk police received a report about the disappearance of Svetlana Orlova. Major Savelyev froze when he heard her last name and occupation. The fourth one. He immediately drove to the scene. And it was then that luck, which had eluded them for so long, finally smiled upon them for the first time. Boys swimming in the Pakra River stumbled upon a strange bag stuck in the willow roots. They called the adults. When the bag was opened, even experienced operatives recoiled in disgust. Savelyev realized this was his chance. He ordered the area cordoned off, and divers called in. They were to comb every centimeter of the bottom. The killer had made his first mistake, and this mistake could cost him his freedom. The discovery on the Pakra River was what the investigation team had been waiting for almost 1 year. A foothold. It was no longer just a disappearance, but a crime scene, albeit a secondary one. Divers worked without break for 2 days. They raised 3 more bags. They contained the remaining parts of Svetlana Orlova's body. As in the previous case, the head was missing. But in one of the bags, which was better preserved in the silt, criminologists found a real treasure. The bag was an ordinary potato sack, but the rope with which it was tied was unusual. It was a piece of imported twine with a thin green fishing line woven into it, the kind some companies use to package goods so the rope is stronger. Experts established that only one company imported such twine into Russia, and it was supplied mainly to large construction markets and wholesale bases. This was the first clue. The second turned out to be even more important. In the folds of the clothes in which the remains were wrapped, a trace evidence expert found a microscopic soil sample atypical for the riverbank. Analysis showed that it contained particles of cement dust and wooden sawdust of a specific type. Pine. The picture began to clear. The killer most likely worked or spent time in a place where construction materials and a sawmill were nearby. Major Savelyev immediately ordered his men to check all construction markets and bases in Podolsk and the surrounding areas. Operatives showed sellers and workers a sample of the twine and asked them about a tall, silent man with a square face. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but there was no other choice. While the investigation was underway, fear in the suburban districts reached its peak. Newspapers, which previously wrote about disappearances only in the crime news section, now came out with screaming headlines. Maniac nicknamed the Brick hunts business ladies. Monster in the Moscow suburbs dismembers his victims. The story became overgrown with terrifying rumors. Women entrepreneurs, who just yesterday felt like masters of their new life, began hiring bodyguards. Many stopped traveling alone, especially in the evenings. The name The Brick turned from a police nickname into an urban legend, a terrifying story whispered in hushed tones. And this panic, strangely enough, helped the investigation. One of these frightened women, Veronika Odintsova, the owner of a furniture store in Chekhov, called the police. She said that about 1 month ago, she had hired a man for minor repairs who looked very much like the description in the newspapers. His name was Andrei. He seemed strange to her, too quiet and somewhat detached. Once, she accidentally saw what was in his sports bag, which he always carried with him. Among the tools, she noticed a large knife or cleaver, neatly wrapped in cloth. At that moment, she didn't attach any importance to it. But now, having read the articles, she was horrified. She said that Andrei was very interested in her work schedule. He asked if she drove the car herself, and if she wasn't afraid to return home late alone. Veronika fired him after 1 week because his silent presence began to oppress her. She didn't know his last name, but remembered he said he lived somewhere in the private sector on the outskirts of Podolsk and rented a room. This was a breakthrough. Now Savalayev had not only a psychological profile, but also a specific territory to search. He mobilized all local police officers in Podolsk. The task was set very strictly. Visit every house in the private sector, every dacha, and every shack, asking the owners about tenants. Of particular interest were single men renting housing without documents. And on the third day of these thorough checks, local police Lieutenant Sidorov stumbled upon what they were looking for. On the outskirts of the city, in an abandoned dacha settlement, stood a crooked little house where a lonely old woman, Baba Nyura, lived. She said that for several months she had been renting a shed in the yard to a man. He was quiet, healthy, built like a tank. He called himself Andrei. He paid regularly, didn't drink, didn't make noise. Only his eyes were scary, empty. And he always carried a heavy bag, the old woman complained. When the policeman showed her the composite sketch made from the descriptions of Veronika Odintsova and the saleswoman from the flower pavilion, Baba Nyura gasped and crossed herself. "That's him! God save us!" The shed Kravtsov rented was in the back of the plot, hidden from prying eyes by elderberry bushes. Savalayev realized this was the perfect hideout. Storming it would be too dangerous. Kravtsov was a former prisoner, strong as an ox, and likely armed. He could easily escape through neighboring abandoned plots. They decided to set an ambush. 2 snipers were positioned in Baba Nyura's house. Several more Oman, special police fighters, hid in the bushes along the perimeter of the plot. The old woman was told to behave as usual and not give away the police presence. All that remained was to wait. Kravtsov always returned to his lair late at night, like a predator after a hunt. Meanwhile, Kravtsov himself had already chosen his 5th victim. He didn't read newspapers and didn't suspect that the net around him was tightening. After 4 successful acts of justice, his self-confidence had grown into a sense of complete invulnerability. He considered himself an instrument of a higher power, a sanitizer cleansing the world of parasites. His new target was Olga Tumanova, a 39-year-old owner of 2 dental clinics in Serpukhov. Bright, beautiful, successful. She drove an almost new Honda and lived in a house that was considered elite at the time. Kravtsov got a job as a cleaner in the housing office that serviced her building. He watched her for several weeks, studying her habits. He knew the exact time she left for work, the time she returned, and where she parked her car. He had already prepared his kit, rope, gloves, bags, and the cleaver. He was waiting for the right moment. This moment was supposed to come on the very night the police set up the ambush at Baba Nyura's shed on the evening of September the 20th, 1996. Andrei Kravtsov finished his shift as a cleaner, took his sports bag, and went to Serpukhov. He planned to wait for Olga in the underground garage of her house. But fate decreed otherwise. Olga's child fell ill, and she cancelled all evening appointments, leaving work 3 hours earlier than usual. When Kravtsov arrived at the parking lot, her car was already gone. Disappointed, he decided not to risk it and returned to his hideout in Podolsk to try again the next day. He took the last electric train. The carriage was almost empty. He looked into the dark window, and his face was reflected in the glass, heavy, motionless, like a mask. He didn't know that he was riding not to his sanctuary, but into a trap. Kilometers away from him, in a cold autumn garden, tens of eyes were watching the gates of the old house, awaiting the appearance of the beast. The hunt for the brick was coming to an end. It was around midnight when Kravtsov's figure emerged from the darkness. He walked with his usual heavy gait, not looking back. He was calm and confident. His animal instincts, which had saved him more than once, were silent this time. He was too absorbed in thoughts of the failed hunt and the anticipation of tomorrow's. When he approached the gate, a short order crackled in Major Savalayev's walkie-talkie. "Let's do it!" Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The beam of a powerful flashlight hit Kravtsov in the face, blinding him. At the same time, Oman fighters lunged at him from all sides in the darkness. He didn't even have time to resist. His huge body was thrown to the ground, his hands twisted behind his back. He didn't make a sound, only breathed heavily, his face buried in the dew-covered grass. When Saveliev approached him and squatted down, Kravtsov raised his head. There was no fear or surprise in his eyes, only cold, heavy indifference. "Andrei Petrovich Kravtsov?" asked the major. "You are arrested on suspicion of committing a series of murders." The detainee remained silent. His famous square face, which brought him his nickname, resembled a stone mask. The hunt for the brick was over. The first interrogations yielded nothing. Kravtsov sat in the cell, staring at one point, and was silent. He refused food, water, and a lawyer. It seemed he had turned to stone. Psychologists who worked with him threw up their hands. They had hit a wall. But Saveliev knew that such a wall could be breached. He chose the right moment. When Kravtsov was on the verge of physical exhaustion, the major entered his cell alone, without accompaniment. He placed photos of the dismembered bodies of his victims on the table. "Did they offend you, somehow, Andrei?" Saveliev asked quietly. "Did they laugh at you, humiliate you? Did they consider themselves masters of life and you a nobody? Is that true?" And Kravtsov broke. He began to speak. He spoke for hours, without stopping, in a hoarse, dispassionate voice. It was not a confession, not repentance. It was a manifesto. He spoke of higher justice, of how he was not a killer, but a cleaner, ridding the world of greedy and gluttonous women. He described every murder with frightening details, every blow of the cleaver, savoring the details. He regretted nothing. The only thing that upset him was that he failed to carry out the sentence on Olga Tumanova. His monologue caused a shiver in experienced operatives. They saw before them not a human, but an ideological monster who had created his own twisted system of morality. The search of Baba Nura's shed gave the investigation irrefutable evidence. In a pit, under rotten floorboards, they found his working kit. The very butcher's cleaver with traces of blood from all his victims, skeins of rope, bags, and gloves. But the most terrifying find was his trophies. In a tin tea box, Kravtsov kept things belonging to the murdered women. Antonina Velichko's expensive lighter, Irina Samoilova's gold pendant, keys to Svetlana Orlova's Audi, and Marina Skuratova's business card. He kept them not as valuables, but as proofs of his victories, like scalps taken from enemies. In the shed, a map of the Moscow region was also found with red crosses marking the places where he abandoned cars and disposed of bodies. Several more crosses were in districts where he was only planning his hunt. Forensic psychiatric examination declared Andrei Kravtsov sane. Experts described him as a person with dissocial personality disorder, devoid of empathy, compassion, and a sense of guilt. He was fully aware of his actions and considered them absolutely correct. The trial of the Moscow monster was held behind closed doors. The details of the case were too shocking. During the hearings, Kravtsov behaved calmly, but defiantly. He didn't look at the relatives of his victims sitting in the courtroom. He looked at the judge with a slight smile, as if everything happening was merely an annoying nuisance for him. When he was given the last word, he stood up and said only one phrase. "It's a pity I didn't have time to do more." The sentence was predictable. The highest measure of punishment, which at that time, due to the moratorium, was replaced by life imprisonment in a special regime colony. In the colony known as Black Dolphin, even hardened killers and recidivists feared him. His complete indifference to threats, punishment, and life itself created an aura of inhuman horror around him. He communicated with no one. He spent all his time in solitary confinement and, according to the guards, never showed a shadow of remorse. For residents of towns and villages near Moscow, the name The Brick forever became a symbol of that terrible era, a time when the collapse of the old world and the emergence of wild capitalism spawned monsters. People broken by poverty, indifference, and their own hatred, who saw no other way out for themselves than to take the lives of others who seemed happier and more righteous than their own. 5 destroyed destinies, tens of broken lives of their loved ones. Such was the price of higher justice in the understanding of a simple orphanage boy. Andrei Kravtsov, who never managed to find his place in a world that had rejected him,